My name is Adam Stolberg, and I'm an associate professor here at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs. And at the same time, I co-direct the policy research arm of the school, the Center for International Strategy, Technology, and Policy. And we're in the capacity of both those institutions, I'm very proud to be able to host this event. As you all know and can appreciate, really in the last week or so, the civil war in Syria has really taken its toll. Over the last more than 2 years, there have been over 4 million people displaced, 2 million refugees in neighboring countries have been displaced. There have been more than 110,000 people killed, including over 1,400 people from the most recent sarin attack in August. Needless to say, the war and the possible U.S. involvement in the conflict continues to generate rather intense international and domestic set of debates. And for the past 10 days or so, at the crux of that debate has been a debate over whether or not the United States should use military force. But really, since President Obama laid down his red line for holding the Assad regime accountable for their use of chemical weapons, there's been much consternation over whether and how the U.S. should intervene in general in this conflict. And to be clear, since that red line was issued, the Obama administration and the president personally has found himself caught in a number of very divisive dilemmas, at the top of which is how to balance the strategic imperative to do something to uphold the sanctity of an international norm against widespread opposition both at home and abroad for U.S. military action. At the same time, the president's also been hemmed in by a dilemma by how to intervene, and how to intervene in a manner forceful enough to produce the desired strategic results, but in a manner that is politically tolerable both at home and abroad. And in fact, the center of gravity of these debates and of these dilemmas has shifted somewhat over the last several days due to the most recent diplomatic foray initiated by the Russians. And while the international community is breathing a collective sigh of relief at the prospects of possibly peacefully stepping back from the brink and following through on a diplomatic solution, there are a lot of debates and concerns and challenges over the modalities of how this would happen. And some people suggest that we find ourselves moving away from the dilemmas of military intervention to the dilemmas of the sort of hand-to-hand combat of diplomacy over following through on these agreements amid tremendous uncertainty. Needless to say, there is a lot of debate. But often lost in these debates, especially over the debates of the day, are some of the deeper issues that can inform the assessment. Because as President Obama has turned his policy over to the Congress and for discussion, it's also bled into the streets and into the halls of classrooms and other public fora. And so as part of an effort to facilitate an informed debate, as well as for the campus community to learn more about what's offered here at Georgia Tech, I've invited some of my colleagues to share some of their insight and different angles and dimensions to this conflict, to help us not so much give predictions about what lies ahead, but how to frame and how to understand some of these debates so that you personally can become more involved and engaged and understand some of these challenges. So with me today are, as I mentioned, are four of my colleagues in the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs. And for those of you who don't know, yes, Georgia Tech does have a School of International Affairs. And those of us who study international affairs look at the range of topics from variety of different theoretical, policy analytical perspectives, some from very technical perspectives. And so what we thought we'd do today is give you a sampling of how we look at problems, and particularly the Syrian crisis that faces the Obama administration, through these different lenses. So again, I've asked my colleagues to maybe frame several different issues, from some of the legal issues, both at home and with respect to international law, some of the issues related to the WMD and the chemical weapons dimension to the conflict, some of the regional security dimensions to the conflict, and some of the non-state actor dimensions to the conflict. And then I may say a few words about the Russian dimension. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, who is my colleague, Dr. Robert Kennedy. For those of you who don't know Bob, he is really an institution in itself here at the school, teaching courses on U.S. foreign policy, on U.S. intelligence issues, and he's going to talk a little bit about some of the legal, both domestic and international, dimensions to the U.S. Use of force issue. So, Bob? And just while he's setting up, I think the format will be each one of our our faculty members will give about a 10-minute or so, 10, 15-minute or so presentation, after which we'll turn it over and take questions and engage in a dialogue, because that's really what this is about.
Okay. The first thing I want to do is mention a couple of words about strategy and where I think the President has gone wrong. I think there are two principal issues that I think the President could have handled better. One issue in strategy is regime change. If you're trying to affect behavior change, you're unlikely to get very much support from the person you're trying to affect or any of his colleagues by saying, we're going to try to depose you. So making the comment that we were seeking regime change cut us off from a lot of avenues, perhaps to effect some behavioral change, either on the part of Assad or on the part of actors around Assad, and that might include Russia. Second thing I think that the President did wrong, and he tried to correct it more recently, is painting himself in the corner by drawing a red line. When you draw a red line, you throw the initiative to the other side, and they can decide whether or not to cross it and call your bluff. And that's the dilemma the President's in right now. And that's the one, in many respects, that Adam was alluding to here. What I want to do next is I want to talk about the international legalities and domestic legalities of the use of force, because we all know that the President has said that force is still on the table. So let's talk very briefly a little bit about the basis in international law for presidential action. Can you click on, or do I have to click these? Or somebody click these things? Just, is that going to be it? Yeah, there we are. So Chapter 7 is what guides us. The Security Council should determine the existence of any threat to peace, breach of peace, or act of aggression, and shall make recommendations to decide what measures shall be taken. In international law, it is the Security Council. The United States was the principal in pushing ahead for the United Nations. The building of the United Nations, the name itself came from the United Nations that fought the Nazis during World War II. And of course, the document itself and the agreement itself was forged at Dunbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C. before wars ended. So we're the principal creators of this document. In Chapter 7 gave the responsibility of the Security Council. Next one. Slide, please. Oh, all right, next slide, please. Who knows? I don't know if he's okay, so Article 41, the Security Council may decide what measures not involving the use of armed force that might be taken by the international community. When we talk about the Security Council, we're talking about, as a minimum, 5 members have to agree, because 5 members have veto power over any action taken by the Security Council. Those members are the United States, Russia, PRC, People's Republic of China, France, and the United Kingdom. Now, you know, we went to war with, in Korea with the authority of the United Nations. That's because the Soviet Union walked out and the People's Republic of China wasn't there. It was China, Republic of China on Taiwan. Party 1, they can decide what measures short of the use of armed force. Next slide, please. And under Article 42, Chapter 7, they can decide which measures, if non-force measures are necessary, they can decide which measures might be taken, including the use of armed force. Next slide, please. So nothing in the present charter shall impair the inherent right of collective self-defense if you are attacked. So the Security Council has responsibility to make the determination in all other cases except when you are under armed attack. For self-defense purposes, you may take action. It's recognized. It's also recognized under international law, ladies and gentlemen, that if there's a threat of imminent attack, you may act. We made that explicit for the Bush Doctrine, but it's always been implicit in international law, but it has to be eminent. The argument in Iraq was it wasn't eminent. So under international law, as long as Russia and China decide to block the action of the United Nations Security Council, the United States cannot act in accordance with international law. That does not mean it won't act. The United States has often, and as have other countries, acted when they felt it was in their interest to act outside international law. So let's look at our own domestic law. There was an article that came out in the paper the other day, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, one of the foremost papers in international affairs. Legally, Obama could launch Syria strike. Ladies and gentlemen, I will tell you that in my own view, that is patently incorrect, and I will show you why. And they're referring to the War Powers Act, which I will get to very quickly. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. The Constitution gives power to Congress to declare war or grant letters of marque and reprisal. Next slide. Letter of marque and reprisal is a license authorizing somebody else to go to war for you, in essence. It's limited war. Next slide, please. Supreme Court cases, there are 3 of them took place right after 1798, when we almost went to war with France in what was called a quasi-war. These 3 cases substantiated the fact that it is Congress and Congress alone that the Constitution grants the whole powers to authorize hostilities, whether they be general or limited or partial. Next slide. So you might say, well, what about in emergencies? Well, cases we have here, both Martin and Mott and the Price cases in the 1800s verify that under certain conditions the President can act. Though the power to act in exigencies belongs to the President, it is limited. And it is exercised upon sudden emergencies. Sudden emergencies, great occasions of state, under circumstances which may be vital to the existence of the Union. Well, ladies and gentlemen, Syria doesn't fit that. Prize cases reaffirms the President can respond to sudden attacks. We're not being attacked. And it goes on to say Congress alone has the power to declare. Next slide, please. What about protect American citizens? Which incidentally is probably not the case either in Syria, but the Supreme Court cases, this actually was never made it to the Supreme Court. It was New York District Court. Iran versus Hollins, 1860. Supreme Court recognized the President has a right to act, protect American lives and property in certain circumstances. They never defined what those circumstances were. Next slide, please. So we might ask, where does the President get his power? How does the President claim, how does George Bush and others claim they have plenary powers? The Constitution requires the President to take an oath of office to the best of his ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Not the United States, the Constitution of the United States. Also designates the President as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. Next slide, please. So the Supreme Court has ruled in a case called In Re Nagel. This means that they have an opposing party. Supreme Court ruled as a consequence of this oath, the President is invested with necessary and implied powers. Thus, the President's duty was not limited to the enforcement of acts of Congress or treaties of the United States according to their expressed terms. And so it includes a great other thing. If it is not forbidden by the Constitution or the laws of the nation, the President has the power to act. We're moving now toward more presidential power. Next slide, please. Then we had a case, a very important case in 1936, United States versus Kurtz Wright Export Corp. In the name of the court, Justice George Suderlin, who went beyond the requirements of this particular case, incidentally, declared that this case was dealing not just with an authority vested in the President of Congress, but with such an authority plus the very delicate, plenary, and exclusive power of the President, the sole organ of the federal government in your national relation. That has been the case. That as Commander-in-Chief, and by virtue of the powers, the oath of office that he takes, and by virtue of the fact that it's already been said by a Supreme Court that he's the sole organ of government, the President has said they can act. Next slide, please. What those people always fail to mention is right down further in that final written report by Justice Sutherland, who was writing for the court itself. like every other governmental power, must be exercised in subordination of the applicable provisions of the Constitution. The provisions of the Constitution don't permit him to act by himself without the Constitution. Next slide, please. So enter the War Powers Resolution, passed by both houses of Congress over the veto of President Nixon, passed in part to further circumscribe the power of the President, which seemed to be growing up to the Vietnam War. You know, President Truman, we didn't go to war, we had to lose that in Korea. Congress did authorize the President to act on some pretty narrow evidence that we've been attacked, that the two destroyers turned Troy and Maddox have been attacked by the North Vietnamese. The second attack was very problematical. Next slide, please. So, what are the authorities that granted them the war powers? I'm going to cut this short because I'm running out of time. We did maybe give me 15 minutes. Next slide, please. Constitutional powers. It says in the War Powers Act, these are the only three ways the President can go to war. Right at the very beginning of this, it says, under a declaration of war, Congress has that authority. It says specific statutory authorization. Statutory means law. Law means Congress acting together with the President. And in a national emergency created by an attack on the United States, its territories, or its possessions or armed forces. Does any of that sound like it meets the Syrian case? I'm not arguing against going and doing this. I'm just saying, from a domestic point of view, don't believe, in my view, that the President has unfettered plenary power and given to him by the courts and the Constitution to take you to war. Next slide, please. The President is supposed to consult. There's a little vagueness here when it says he has to consult with Congress. And somebody will say, well, if he has to consult, that means he must be able to do it anyway. Not so. Next slide. In the absence of a declaration of war, in any case which the United States Armed Forces are introduced into hostilities or into situations where hostilities are clearly involved, tell me the living figures. Into the territory, airspace, and waters of a foreign nation, in numbers which substantially enlarge the United States Armed Forces equipped for combat. We don't have anybody considered. Anything we introduced. Next slide, please. Next slide. Look at that one. He's supposed to report that he's done it. And he's supposed to report with three items. One, the circumstances that required us to do this, report to Congress. Second, the constitutional and legislative authority under which he took action. There's only three ways constitutionally, and that's been reinforced by the courts, that the President can take action. And finally, the estimated scope and duration. Next slide, please. He has to do some further reporting. Next slide, please. Treaties. We talked, the President has made a thing about, well, the international community should enforce these treaties like the chemical weapons treaty. That's true. The United States, in our view, probably should do that. So should the other countries. But it is not an authority for the United States to go to war. It does not give the President the authority to go to war because some nation has broken a treaty that the United States has signed. Next slide, please. That's been invalidated. Next slide. Finally, so it says right in this joint resolution, passed over the head of the President, nothing in this joint resolution is intended to alter the constitutional authority of Congress or of the President for the provision of existing treaties. Ladies and gentlemen, there is nothing in the War Powers Resolution that gives the President the authority, in my view, to go to war without congressional authorization. Thank you very much for your time. You can see how we passed it.
Thanks, Bob. Our next speaker is Dr. Margaret Casal. Maggie, as she's known to us, is an assistant professor here in the Sam Nunn School. She teaches courses on WMD, non-proliferation or proliferation, counterterrorism and emerging technologies in international security. And I'm proud to say that she just came back from a stint advising the Chief of Staff of the Army on some of these issues. So Maggie is going to talk to us a little bit about the chemical weapons dimension to the conflict.
Thanks, Adam. First off, I want to say that it is awesome to see this standing room only audience here. I mean, this is a testament to Georgia Tech students and the Georgia Tech community that we are interested in the global community beyond the campus, beyond Atlanta, and beyond our own borders. And that is really fantastic. So congratulations to all of you. This is great. Okay, so the first thing I want to speak to is that at first the alleged use and what now has been confirmed use of chemical weapons in Syria shows that chemical weapons are not an artifact of history. If no other lesson is to be taken from this, that is what it should be. Too often over the last decade, particularly in the United States and in the Western world, the national security community has sort of perpetuated this treatment of chemical weapons that they are a lesser included danger of other weapons and that they basically are an artifact of history. Sometimes the chemical weapons threat has been outrightly dismissed. For example, 2008, there was the congressionally chartered bipartisan Commission on the Prevention of Weapons of Mass Destruction and Terrorism, known as the Graham-Talent Commission. That commission refused to look at chemical weapons. They only considered biological and nuclear weapons. And perhaps the greatest irony is that in their commission's report, in the executive summary, they predicted that, quote, unless the world community acts decisively and with great urgency, it is more likely than not that a weapon of mass destruction will be used in a terrorist attack somewhere in the world by the end of 2013. Well, it seems their prediction was correct because a chemical weapon was used before the end of 2013. It wasn't a biological weapon, it wasn't a nuclear weapon, and it also was by a state, not by a terrorist group. So that's sort of the first lesson to come out of this whole crisis. Chemical weapons are not an artifact of history. A question that I've been asked a number of times is, why does this matter to the United States? Sort of the first answer to that is because the U.S. has taken a leadership position in the international community on preventing the proliferation of WMD. As Bob articulated, we have been a leader in international agreements and international organizations over the past century. Further on that, we have valuable allies in the region who are very concerned with regard to potential proliferation. We also live in a globalized world in which WMD are not likely to be constrained by usual geographic barriers. There's another piece that if one dives into the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, it's well known that Saddam Hussein's regime used chemical weapons against its own citizens. A little bit lesser well known is that they also used chemical weapons against the Iranian troops in the 1980s. At that time, Iran had made a decision to not develop, to not have any WMD programs. As the Iranians saw the use, and were subjected to the use themselves of chemical agents in the Iran-Iraq War, and they saw that there was no response from the international community, the lesson they learned, and this is a very basic arms racing lesson, was if we're not going to have these weapons, we are going to be impacted by them disproportionately. So the Iranians started a CW program, developed CW agents, and used them in much lesser quantity than the Iraqis. But this is why it matters to have a leadership position. It matters to ensure that there are consequences and that the world community does respond. Again, this is especially problematic for chemical weapons, and as we extend it to terrorists, because if one looks at the use of WMD by non-state actors, terrorists, over the course of over 100 years, 81% of the actual uses, so that's not plots, that's not attempted acquisitions, 81% of the actual uses by a non-state actor of a WMD agent has been a chemical agent. So that it works out to be more than 270 uses. So if we're looking at probability, this is where you're seeing it come from the chemical weapons. Another lesson to be drawn from the experience that we're watching in Syria, which ties back to all of these reasons the United States should be concerned, is that there's a need for better remote detection, remote verification, remote monitoring technologies. And this is a great example of the intersection of policy, national security, and science and technology. So there needs to be better verification, better technology methodologies for detecting chemical agents, biological agents, nuclear agents, and a lot of that requires investment in basic research. We need new areas and new work in physics, in chemistry, and biology to really advance to be able to do remote detection. So there's a need for investment in the very basic research. Better verification data is needed to enable more robust political and foreign policy choices. I mean, we've been waiting, and by we, I mean sort of the international community, has been waiting for the UN report that was released today, which was the result of the inspectors who went in and gathered data, and they've come out and they've said, yes, there definitely was chemical weapons use. Now, Ban Ki-moon is being very circumspect in not stating who it was. Most of us consider there to be the overwhelming evidence that was by the Syrian regime. So you've got a need for responding, but verification data, better monitoring data is also important because those capabilities enable non-proliferation efforts. And if they are credibly communicated, if we can show that we detected with great certainty as they were happening, that also is effectively a deterrent. I.e., if you use this, we know who used it, we know where it came from, and we can trace it back. So again, bridging across the science of technology and international affairs. If one looks to the history of the Syrian chemical weapons program, and again, this goes to a whole number of these themes I'm sort of hitting on, I mean, it dates back to the 1970s. Syrians are thought to have first received chemical weapons, munitions from the Egyptians. Some people put it as early as the early 70s. You might see as late as the early 1980s, so late 1970s. They also received chemical weapons and munitions from the former Soviet Union. And more recently, they're obtaining starting materials as well as assistance from Iran and some other suspected nations. But at this point, it's largely an indigenous capability. That is, they can produce it on their own. Now, some of the weapons systems are coming from other nations, but the chemicals themselves, largely an indigenous production. So Syria's chemical weapons are not a surprise. And again, this is one of these things that goes to this idea of this is not an artifact of history. We've known it. But it also points to a limitation within the current international community and the current international agreements to sort of be able to do something. We have to wait till something happens to be able to do something. And a lot of this goes to the Chemical Weapons Convention. The Biological Weapons Convention is even more problematic. It has no verification protocol and is even more problematic. So I think hopefully all of you know that there was a framework that was agreed to by Secretary of State Kerry and the Foreign Minister of Russia, Lavrov. It was released on Saturday. So this is an initial framework between the United States and Russia. This is not an agreement on the destruction or the demilitarization of the Syrian chemical weapons stockpile. The Syrians have 7 days. They are supposed to report to the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. That's the UN sort of watchdog group that's responsible for implementing the Chemical Weapons Convention. The Syrians are supposed to report within 7 days what is their stockpile, what are their facilities, what are their production facilities, and what is the state of the weaponizations, the munitions. So we'll see if that happens, first of all. And then the timeline that was proposed by Kerry and Lavrov is extremely ambitious. The United States began efforts to destroy our former offensive stockpile under the first President Bush. So that was where the decision was made to actually begin destruction of our former offensive chemical weapons stockpile. We still have over 3,600 tons. They're at 2 sites, Kentucky and Pueblo, Colorado. Not likely to be destroyed. I mean, the question is, are they going to be destroyed before 2020? I don't think so. So the timeline going forward on the destruction of the Syrian arsenal, which is guesstimated to be about 1,000 tons, is looking at projecting it out in about a year to 2 years. That's not likely, or it's very ambitious. It would be fabulous if they did it. I wouldn't expect it, particularly because this has to be negotiated, yet through the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. Another piece that I want to highlight, and this will sort of be my concluding remark, is if a framework or an actual negotiation deal is put in place to destroy the chemical weapons, there will be international inspectors from the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons who oversee the destruction of the Syrian chemical weapons stockpile. Now, that is what they are there to do. They're not there, and this is the same thing, we have inspections that come to the United States, there are inspections that go to Russia as they are destroying their stockpile. All inspectors from the international community are there to verify destruction of declared stockpiles. They're not there to look for hidden weapons. They're not there to look for new weapons that might be transferred in. They're not there to look for any evidence of newly produced weapons beyond what might be declared. So there are a whole lot of proliferation challenges if an agreement is made that will go forward. And these especially are going to impact other states and other actors in the region. And with that, I'm going to conclude my comments and transfer it over.
Thanks, Maggie. Our next speaker is Dr. Lawrence Rubin. Larry is an assistant professor at the Sam Nunn School, and he's our resident Middle East expert. Larry's research looks at both the Arab-Israeli dimension to some of the regional conflicts as well as some of the intra-Arab dimensions to the conflict. Larry also looks at broader regional security issues such as the proliferation of nuclear weapons in the region and nuclear energy issues there, as well as some of the terrorism issues there. And Larry's going to talk a few minutes about Syria's regional context and some of the consequences of the conflict for regional security.
Thank you very much, and thanks for all of you for coming. I think you can hear me now. So with these unpredictable events in the last week, and in fact the last few weeks, or we'll say in the last, 2-3 years as I've been teaching classes here, it only makes sense, I think, to use my time with 2 objectives. First, I'm going to give a bit of a context to understanding Syria in the broader Middle East and from a broader geopolitical perspective, and this in a sense means what Syria has meant for the Middle East and the region and how or why it affects regional structures and alliances. And second, I'll make a few comments on why the recent initiative might mean, or what it might mean and what it might not mean for the region. So let me start with the context. Syria's been an important battleground and at times, in a sense, a fulcrum of Middle East politics. Its transnational identities that links its internal and external relations have both influenced and been influenced by the wider region as it's kind of snuggled between more powerful states, more traditionally powerful states. From the 1950s, Syria was a battleground for intra-Arab struggles at one time between Egypt and Iraq, and also with Egypt against conservative Western-aligned monarchies such as Saudi Arabia. If you want to fast forward really quickly to the 1980s, Syria and Iran developed a strong alliance after Iran's revolution in 1979 when it became the Islamic Republic of Iran. And they've claimed to be supporters of the Palestinian cause, oppose Western imperial intervention, and also claim to share Shia ties when it's politically expedient. Both also shared Iraq as enemies. The focal point, though, of their alliance started with their shared interest in Lebanon, where Syria had intervened a number of years before in the Civil War, and then later against, or more involved when drawn in more against Israel's invasion. The Syrian alliance then converged around Hezbollah, which Dr. Jordan will talk about a little more, a Shia non-state group, and this is that was opposing Israel in its invasion at the time, as well as Western influence. The relationship, anyway, grew both basically as a rejectionist front in the 1990s against the Arab-Israeli peace process and many of the other, so to speak, Western interests, as well as might be known as moderate Arab states that you might have heard of before. So this has put Syria in as an important focus of the Saudi-Iranian rivalry, yet another one I'm going to bring up, which has become one of the central poles of international politics of the Middle East. Now, this rivalry, starting approximately after the Iranian Revolution in 1989, consisting of, say, Saudi Arabia, this Arab Sunni state, versus Iran, a Persian Shia state, battling for things like Islamic leadership in the world, as well as in the Islamic era, particularly Arab Islamic world, as well as Gulf security and broader influence, but particularly focused in the Levant. So as the Saudis and the Iranians competed, Saudi policy has been one of containment largely of Iranian influence through proxy battles that have taken place sometimes along sectarian Sunni Shia lines, not always, but with the latent Saudi ambition of kind of rolling back this Iranian influence. And by, in a sense, peeling away is what I heard many times in the region from many Arab officials as kind of the strategy of what they wanted to do, bring it back to the Arab fold. So for Saudi Arabia, this is a way to strike in this potential opportunity, as well as the Syrian civil war, a way to kind of strike at the main artery of Iranian influence in the Arab world, in the Arab Middle East, and particularly the Levant. For Iran, this is Syria in particular, how important it is. It's a key element of strategic reach into the region to be able to influence politics as spoilers in the Arab-Israeli conflict and to fulfill ideological ambitions in Lebanon by having a Shia party there. This is mentioned briefly in a second, also connected somewhat to domestic politics. So the motivating factors are some of the reasons why the Saudis, a very, very status quo-oriented state, so much so that it was against many of the uprisings that took place, supports the rebels in the 2+ year civil war, and why Iran has staunchly backed the Syrian regime, even when the Iranian policy of supporting the Assad regime during the civil war has come at the expense of losing a lot of support in the Arab world. Support that it worked extremely hard in the last decade, in the 2000s, to try to get. So I'll mention now two thoughts about potential implications for regional peace and security. The first is that there seems to be, even if this initiative goes forward, if it does not help, basically, if it goes forward, I don't see there much effect on a political settlement on the ground in Syria. It may have, in a sense, extended the lifeline to the Assad regime. So you now have two world powers agreeing to work together with the regime. This gives an incentive for the survival of the regime, especially some of the parties that may support the rebels. And even if there are problems or complications along these lines, it puts the parties in an awkward position. So the important players in the region wouldn't be entirely against, many of them wouldn't be entirely against the end of civil conflict with Assad in power, and I'll mention briefly including the Israelis. For the Israelis, Assad is the devil that they know, and it's been that way. It's understood to be a rules of the game modus vivendi with occasional breaches. But this could mean Assad could, again, secure the borders, and chemical weapons may be checked if the initiative or proposal goes forward. Well, there's considerable domestic debate in Israel about what its interest and policy should be. The important overarching question, though, for Israel is what does this agreement mean for Iran? and what lesson will Iran learn from it? And more importantly, though, what will Iran learn from the United States' behavior on this issue? This has been of utmost concern for Israelis and Israelis all along, especially in the last 2 weeks. More importantly, though, if this issue is put to rest, or I'll in a sense say on the flip side, this attention could now be directed back to the most important issue for Israel, Iran's nuclear program, which is also a concern that the Israelis have had, that the interest has been deflected on what they deem as the most important issue. But this also goes for the Gulf states as well, and in particular Saudi Arabia, this missing of what the main issue should be. Saudi has clearly more to gain than Israel, for instance, with the end of the Syrian-Iranian alliance through peeling away Syria from Iran back to the Arab world. But the Saudis, too, want the attention focused on the Iranian nuclear problem, the biggest threat for them. One could argue, in fact, that an end of the Assad regime and the Iranian alliance may actually, though, I would say, make Iran more resolute in pursuing its nuclear program if it suffered such a huge strategic loss, which I mentioned would also play out in domestic politics as well. It could push them further. So that could be a flip side to it. But I want to also talk about what this deal might not mean for the region, and what it might not mean is the end of fighting. It's highly possible that this initiative, as it drags out, could lead nowhere, and the civil war could continue and turn Syria into a Lebanon, a country that fought officially civil war for 15 years, and is still racked by ethno-religious sectarian fighting. Syria has diverse ethno-religious ties across borders, and it already has foreign intervention at the regional and global levels. The only difference is that, or one of the main differences, is Syria's strong military institutions, and particularly ethnic sectarian groups whose survival is tied to the state and survival of the regime at this period. The results could be the worsening of a humanitarian crisis, one that's basically brought hundreds of thousands of refugees into neighboring countries, including Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, and is threatening in some of the places, or can very much threaten political stability in those countries. So I've hopefully laid out a couple of key points where Syria falls into the broader regional context and its relationship to other issues such as the Iranian nuclear question. I also welcome questions in Q&A when it comes to the other countries that I wasn't able to talk about in this short period of time. But I want to leave you one other broader question that at least I've been thinking about. In the context of, say, the military seizing power in Egypt in early July from the Islamists who gained power after the Arab uprisings, and with the dual possibilities of this continuation and consolidation of Assad's power, one question you might ask is, what does this mean, this new event potentially, this initiative that would get the great powers to work together and reinstate Assad to some extent or continue fighting? What does it mean for the Arab uprisings? Are they over? Is this period over? And more particularly, what does it mean for regional peace and security? Thank you.
Thanks, Larry. And finally, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Jenna Jordan. And Jenna is one of our most recent acquisitions here at the Sam Nunn School, and I'm very proud to be able to host a panel with her. Jenna's expertise is on the study of international terrorism. Some people say she's our resident terrorist, but we'll leave that for you to decide. She has specific expertise on some of the terrorist groups of direct relevance to the Syrian conflict, Hezbollah, and also Hamas. She is probably known to a number of you who are casual readers of international relations as well, because a lot of her technical research has also found its way into some of the popular literature on assessing alternative strategies of counterterrorism. She also does work on unmanned air vehicles and on the international security implication of population transfer. So Jenna's going to talk about the non-state dimension, and particularly the Hezbollah angle.
All right. Thank you so much. Okay, so my comments today are basically going to focus on the issue of non-state actors. Specifically, I'm going to look at the relationship of Hezbollah and then other militant non-state actors that are operating in Syria. So I'm going to first start with Hezbollah, and then I'll talk more about the Syrian rebel opposition groups. So Hezbollah has a very important relationship to Syria, and I think one that kind of complicates some of the strategic decisions that the U.S. faces and other actors face in the region. Hezbollah receives political, financial, military assistance from Iran, and Syria has been an important route by which this assistance has been able to reach Hezbollah. So that has very important implications for the whole, for the civil war, which I'll talk about. So Hezbollah has also provided important support for Assad's forces in Syria. And some people have argued that without their help, there's like thousands of Hezbollah fighters fighting on the side of Assad's forces. It's unlikely that Syrian forces would have been able to reclaim Qusair in June, and they'd have a harder time holding Damascus and other key areas. It's not really clear how much Nasrallah, who's the head of Hezbollah, actually supports Assad, or whether they're trying to help Iran, who supplies this important military support. Now, interestingly, Hezbollah sort of historically has been held in very high regard in the Arab world. They've achieved lots of political goals. They've been very successful. They have lots of support on the ground. However, their support was somewhat diminished when they started to support Assad in the uprising in early 2011. And people have argued that it's further declined as Hezbollah fighters have been joining Syrian forces on the battlefield against the opposition, who are primarily Sunni. And the Sunnis in Lebanon have more recently sort of been emboldened by the success of the Sunni opposition in Syria, and ideally would like to undermine the Shia hold on power in Beirut. So you see that, the sectarian dimension, I think, is really quite relevant to the conflict. And in fact, in Lebanon recently, there's been sort of an increase in sectarian attacks in Beirut and other cities as well. So in a way, Hezbollah's actually taken a bit of flack for sort of straying from its traditional enemy, which has been Israel, and this has led to this increase in conflict in Lebanon. And many Lebanese Sunnis feel a connection with the Sunnis in Syria and have become to see Hezbollah as sort of more of an enemy. Now, in a more extreme interpretation, I think you could argue that the sectarian conflict, of the sectarian conflict in Lebanon, some have argued that Hezbollah might even see the war in Syria as vital to its own survival in a way. They see a Sunni fight as inevitable, but they'd rather do it on the battlefield in Syria than in their home in Lebanon. And Hezbollah fighters see that they're fighting al-Qaeda extremists and the Americans who are backing them. So there's lots of different dimensions going on in the conflict there. And the idea really is that whoever controls Syria is going to control Lebanon. So that intensifies the battle in Syria. Moreover, if Assad leaves power, it's going to be very difficult for Hezbollah. So that complicates things further. And then just even on sort of thinking about, potential strikes when, this was more obviously in the rhetoric just, a week ago, it seems like a month ago. Hezbollah sort of claimed that they would carry out strikes against Israel if the United States launched military action against Syria. So how credible those threats are, I think, is unclear, but that was in the discourse. So now I want to turn and look a little bit at some of the non-state actors in Syria. There's lots and lots of them. And I want to talk both a little bit about the opposition and then those that are loyal to the Assad regime. Now, the uprising against Assad is very disorganized. Some estimates have said there's like 1,200 rebel groups operating, fighting Assad, and it relies to a great extent on foreign support, not just U.S. support. Now, the overall uprising has grown large enough, and it's been successful. It's pushed regime forces out of vast areas in the north and the east in Syria. So I'm just going to mention a few of the groups. So the Free Syrian Army is probably what's sort of most well known to everyone. It's what's in the media the most. And this name is sort of most popular amongst these autonomous armed faction. But there's no real structure to the Free Syrian Army. Most of these actors have been backed by not just the U.S., but by Turkey, by Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, and have been trying since 2012 to develop a more centralized rebel leadership and use their control over funding and weapons to sort of organize local groups into larger alliances to be a more effective force. And then there's the Supreme Military Command, the SMC. And this was sort of the most recent attempt to create a central leadership for the Free Syrian Army, for the FSA. And December 12th, this sort of really began to try to create a sense of leadership. And the rebels actually have been told that they must endorse the SMC and its political goals in order to gain access to future arms and shipments. And the US and the UK and France actually announced that that would be the organization through which they would channel any support for the rebels. And it's big. I mean, it's substantial. And in June 2013, the SMC claimed to control 80,000 fighters, although interestingly, they later said, oh, no, actually, it's 320,000. So it's hard to know, for all of these groups, it's very hard to do a sort of head count in all kind of militant, clandestine organizations. Now, there's also more hardline Islamist factions that are operating on the part of the rebels. And this is where the complications arise that you hear about in the media so often. So there's the Syrian Islamic Front. They work fairly well with the SMC. They're not part of it. There's Al-Ansar, which is another prominent Salafi faction. And then there's the ISIS, which is the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. And this is probably sort of the most well-known of the hardline groups. And they actually helped to create al-Nusra, which is another one of these groups that actually has been designated by the U.S. as a foreign terrorist organization. And it's these groups that represent the al-Qaeda presence in the area. So that's what I just want to end my comments on, talking a little bit about that connection. And how specifically these groups have reacted to the agreement over the last couple days. I think it's important to mention before I talk about their specific reaction is that there's lots of conflict between all of these opposition groups. There's lots of infighting. And there's also been a more recent kind of backlash against the heavy-handed tactics that have been carried out by the al-Qaeda-affiliated ISIS. Many of the Syrians actually, interestingly, sort of liked the ISIS because they were tired of all the corruption in the Free Syrian Army. But the very harsh interpretation of Islamic law that was invoked by the ISIS is hard for lots of Syrians to handle. So you have this infighting amongst the rebels. You have declining support for the ISIS. And people have argued that it could kind of hurt the position. But it presents a real opportunity, I think, for the more moderate rebels to kind of come more to the forefront. And if the moderates could actually sever their relationships with the al-Qaeda affiliates, then they could possibly elicit more support for the Western backers. So the question kind of becomes, what's the bigger threat? Is it Assad or is it the rise of the ISIS and al-Nusra? And those are some of the challenges I think that some of the, are very, very real for thinking about the strategic dimensions. So everyone in the international community sees this agreement as a success, except I would say the rebels. The widespread view is that everyone gains, right? But the rebels sort of feel that the agreement with the U.S. shows that the U.S. actually wants to prolong Assad's rule. So this complicates things. And I think it puts the U.S. in a very strange situation because the agreement, in theory, does sort of allow at least a temporary continuation of Assad's regime and the idea that they're protecting the rebels from further chemical attacks, not conventional attacks, but chemical attacks. But the U.S. is still funding the rebels, who expect more support, but see it as unlikely now, given this sort of change of events. So I feel that this, sort of the risks inherent in this is that it could be a way to sort of embolden the alliance between more moderate and hardline rebels. That's just, I think that could be one potential outcome. And then just finally, sort of from a foreign policy perspective, the U.S. has not been great in dealing with non-state actors. It's a challenge. It's hard to combat non-state actors. And this I just think about from a counterterrorism perspective more generally. So I think the U.S. needs to think about individuals on the ground and how we can provide support to people so that they aren't being given support primarily from militant organizations. And in my own research, I think a lot about popular support and local support and how oftentimes militants can capitalize on this. And if they're the ones to provide support, it can give more sort of, sort of allow further radicalization of different movements. And I think these are some of the potential things that the U.S. needs to think about in terms of the relationship with non-state actors. So it's tough. I mean, it's this tough balance between I was glad that wasn't my phone. U.S. support for the rebels and this sort of, seeming support for Assad with the given agreement. So, my 2 cents. Thanks for listening.
Before I turn it over to you guys for some Q&A, I want to talk a little bit about the elephant in the room that we haven't talked about, which is Russia. And how do we understand what Russia is doing? Now, I don't pretend to divine any motivations from Vladimir Putin, but it's important to keep in mind a couple of things about the Russian leadership. And I would argue that in general, it's a very conservative, cynical, and a competitive approach to international relations that is embraced by the Kremlin. It's conservative in the sense that notwithstanding President Putin's elegant op-ed in the New York Times, which I'm sure many of you wrote, where he espoused the importance of respecting the sanctity of international law, and especially those related to territorial sovereignty, and he championed universalism over U.S. exceptionalism, Putin first and foremost understands politics. And in that regard, he's status quo oriented. That suits him at home, given his relative position. And it also is the lesser of evils internationally, and especially in the Middle East. Putin generally, his approach to domestic politics is one where, while he has endorsed democratic principles, he feels much more confident with managing the process so that the outcome is more decided. And those of you who have studied what democracies mean may find somewhat of an irony to that understanding of the managed democracy. In addition, Putin, in his new incarnation as president, or renewed incarnation as president, has found himself in a slightly unprecedented situation where he's actually experiencing more domestic political opposition, both during his election and most recently in the mayoral elections that took place across Russia, where a number of his favored candidates or parties fared actually quite poorly, not only in Moscow, but some of the more conservative regions. And while we in the West, and particularly the United States, focus a lot on sort of the liberals and the people that we like, the real story there has to do with the emergence of populist nationalist groups, especially, and not only in the hinterland, but also in Moscow. So Putin has a real incentive in this crisis to stem some of the tide of discontent at home, reassert his leadership by demonstrating that on the international scene. So he's a conservative, and the leadership is generally conservative. It's also cynical. The Russian leadership is generally pragmatic, if not hard-headed realist. Russia generally is motivated less by ideals of human rights or even prestige, and more about material interests and power relations. I would argue that the number one concern for Russia in this conflict has to do with stability, or at least not the proliferation of instability. If you read the Russian discussion of Islamic fundamentalism, there is a very close link between their discussion of groups like Al-Qaeda and al-Nusra and Chechen rebels. And so for them, they draw a distinct connection between instability and radicalization in the Middle East and their own problems with domestic terrorism and dealing with difficult demographic and ethnic problems at home. And therefore, I would argue that the real fear in Moscow is not so much that the U.S. is going to finally get its act together and reassert its primacy in the region and restore U.S. influence. It's that the U.S. is going to bungle the job, and it's going to promote more instability that is going to exacerbate Russia's real problems on its own frontiers. And they also, some of the hypocrisy that others have mentioned has not been lost on the Russians, that they find it hard to believe that we're combating the same groups in Mali as we are supporting in Syria. So they're sort of wondering, despite the platitudes coming from Washington, if we too are not realist about this. Of course, there are some other material interests, but I would argue that they're primarily secondary, those with respect to arms exports to Syria and the region, Iran, energy with oil and pipeline issues, not only or particularly with the Eastern Mediterranean developments and some of the impact on pricing issues. There's also a relatively modest naval resupply base that could be at risk in Syria. And there's also some concerns about reestablishing Russia's relevance via the assertion of sort of a global international order with the Security Council first and foremost, which is a very self-serving interest-based argument because Russia does have a seat in the Security Council and can do all the things that Bob had mentioned. So Russia, in addition to being conservative in their orientation, is also cynical. And finally, I would argue that the leadership is also competitive, and not competitive in the sense that, of a confrontation and seeks to challenge us head on, because Russia today is not what the Soviet Union used to be. But it's more about being opportunistic rather than risky, exploiting weaknesses and opportunities to advance those interests that I had mentioned. If you remember, President Putin is a judo master, and as a judo master, you don't seek to bludgeon your rival, but rather you look for weak points. And the United States, and the Obama administration in particular, as my colleagues have outlined, has provided a litany of opportunity and demonstrated ambivalence and decisiveness, to say the least, that have provided opportunities for Russia to gain some stature on the cheap, I would argue. The challenge for Russia, of course, is going to be if, in fact, this framework agreement does get legs, because all of a sudden Russia has now been foisted into the limelight. The expectation is that Russia can deliver on this framework, and I would argue that the relationship with the Assad regime is one more of a marriage of convenience, and there are limitations to that relationship. At present, there's a convergence of interests, but ultimately the Assad regime is worried about its own survival, and Russia about the spread of instability, and has generally had a relatively sober eye towards Assad and promoting the interests that I've mentioned. So therefore, I would argue that the challenge for the Obama administration is not so much getting this framework agreement, but managing the process to maintain and preserve Russia's incentive to follow through on it, and to shore up, I would argue, Russia's relations with the Syrians, with the Syrian leadership, to deliver on this arrangement. And so it's not so much about trust, and we're not necessarily trusting Vladimir Putin and the Russian leadership. We're not deferring to them, because part of leadership is getting others to do what we want them to do as well. And Russia is presenting both a challenge and an opportunity in that regard. But with that, let me stop the formal part of our panel and flip it over to you guys. And we have a couple mics on different sides of the room that will go around, and we'll try to capture as many of the presentations as possible. And there are some plants out there, but I'll try to have them.
Do you want to point to the person
I
to
will.
pick, or-
Well, we have one over there, so why don't we do that first?
Is that a plant?
No. Oh, wait, can I just ask you to identify yourself and ask one question, but you can address it to at least two people if you'd like.
Okay, I'll try to meet the requirements. I'm Dr. Borowitz. I'm also at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs. And my question is, it really seems like one of the challenges with taking action here is it's not so much about affecting change in Syria as it is about how whatever action is interpreted by a wide variety of different groups. And I think you represent many different groups. So what I'm curious about is, from each of your perspectives, what's the most important lesson or point that ideally the Obama administration would get across with whatever action they take? And what kind of misinterpretation would be most costly or the largest problem?
Okay. Why don't I turn to Larry? Why don't you take a first crack at that?
So the question is, so giving myself a chance to think about your question, but what would be basically the lessons that, if I understood it correctly, that the actors would take in the
What would the Obama administration like the Arab states, for example,
right.
to kind of learn or what the point they would want them to have as a takeaway,
Right.
whatever action?
Well, I don't think, from the American perspective, I would guess that I don't think necessarily that action would have been driven by thinking of the lesson that the Arab states would take away from it. And I think, I would guess the Obama administration is probably exacerbated when it comes to trying to find a way to have policy mean or dictate certain things, because I mean, if you can look at most recently the Egyptian example of support or unsupported, the United States being accused on both sides of supporting the military or supporting the Islamists in that way. So I would see the political issue as being the first and foremost on the Obama administration's perspective, and then I guess in terms of how the actual actors on the ground see things, or how they might interpret this. I think it's actually, I think they're still kind of getting their bearings to see how it's going. From what I've looked at in the last few days, some of the actors have been kind of quiet so far on reacting immediately. The Saudis so far haven't really said anything to my knowledge. The Egyptians are kind of out of the picture to this extent, but I'm sure favoring more in terms of stability. It was very different from under the Morsi regime, who was supportive of the rebels, but they're more on the status quo oriented. So I don't want to take other people's time. The Turkish reaction is important, but I'm going to move it over to my colleague.
Yeah, I'm afraid that it'll be sort of repetitive from some of my comments, but I feel that the Obama administration needs to be very clear about who they're supporting in this particular conflict. I think that, I mean, obviously the administration is afraid that if the Assad regime falls, that there's going to be, an Islamist group that's going to come to power, as we've seen in lots of other situations. And I think that's a very real fear. However, funding rebels that are all kind of, granted, I mean, the funding has been limited, so they've received kind of light weapons. They haven't received like a full, heavy amount of weaponry at this point. But they are receiving, rebels that have affiliations with, Al-Qaeda, very clear affiliations, are receiving support. So I think that there's just a lot, to me, I feel that there's lots of, the sort of lack of clarity, I think, is very real to the rebels on the ground, and I think really influences how they see and how they're likely to align with one another, potentially.
Right?
First off, I totally concur with Bob with respect to the problems of red lines. But to add to that, with respect to the Obama administration, I'm going to take it a little bit different direction. I think that needs to recognize that when members of the administration are addressing issues that are fundamentally domestic politics issues, they can have international politics repercussions. And I'm speaking specifically to Secretary of State Kerry's comments when he was testifying to Congress, in which it was totally in a domestic politics context, made some comments regarding, well, if we use boots on the ground, or if there's a U.S. military action, there are other states in the region that are going to pay for it, which effectively said the U.S. military was going to be treated as a mercenary army. And now, it's a domestic politics issue that he's addressing, which is the debt, which is the cost. But that has international repercussions, as well as repercussions within the defense community. So that would be the think about both the domestic and the international consequences of what you are saying, particularly in a globally connected world.
Okay, thanks. Yes, please.
My question is slightly for Dr. Kennedy, the legal side, and slightly for Dr. Margaret. The legal side, in the Syrian context, President Obama had mentioned last year under a lot of pressure that if they use chemical weapons again to a large, it might be a game changer. He used the word game changer, not red line. However, the media made, to make it simpler, called, now in St. Petersburg last week, he said the red line was drawn by the international community in 1925, and he is referring to that. In that case, the red line should be for the whole world, including ourselves. And then, if it includes everyone, then our allies, like when Saddam Hussein against Ayatollah, he used chemical weapons, and it was provided to them by our allies, Germany and maybe ourselves. Turkey used it against Kurds, and Shah of Iran used against the same Kurds on the other side. And we used Agent Orange in Vietnam on a large scale. So my next question is Agent Orange, which defoliates entire forests, is it chemical warfare or not?
Okay, thank you. Bob, do you want to take a crack at the first part?
Well, with regard to the red line, there was an article in the paper not too long ago that analyzed the statement exactly. It was made by President Obama in the first instance, and it was clear in that statement, and I didn't bring that piece of paper with me, it was clear in that statement that the intent was to draw the red line. And it was clear recently that he attempted to extend that to the international community. This is an extraordinarily complex situation, and there's no doubt that there was motivation to try to keep the Syrian government from using chemical weapons because we knew they had them. That kind of statement that he made recently might have been a better statement made before, instead of the way he put the question when he was responding to that issue in an earlier context. It's not surprising. The reason it's not surprising to me is since Jim Jones left as National Security Advisor, they've had a relatively weak national security team with not a lot of experience. And the net impact of that has been the kind of mistakes that we've seen made by an administration that could have done a better job strategically. I leave the Agent Orange and chemical weapons question for Maggie here, but go ahead, Maggie.
Sure. So with respect to the question of is Agent Orange a chemical weapon, per international law, as well as a sort of technical perspective, no, it is unquestionably not a chemical weapon. Nor is white phosphorus, which one occasionally sees on the internet cited as a chemical weapon. Neither of them are chemical weapons. The Chemical Weapons Convention has very specific schedules of both chemical agents as well as precursors, that those are what constitute chemical weapons. 1925, referring to the Geneva Protocol, I mean, this is where we start to get into some of these internecine sort of international law pieces. Syria is a member of isn't a state party to the Geneva Protocol. The Geneva Protocol only prohibits use, and it only prohibits use in an international conflict. So technically, the Geneva Protocol does not prohibit use in a civil war. So these are these weird little pieces. In the 1980s, with respect to decisions going on in Iran and Iraq, I mean, that was where you had international politics, largely of the Cold War, that were really driving, and the predominant piece there was, you know, we were supporting we were engaged in containment as our overall strategic doctrine, and it was politics versus the Soviet Union.
Thanks, Maggie. Let me ask. Right.
There's going to have to be some kind of power sharing. I agree with you that they should not have said Assad must go or Mubarak must go. Who are we to say who must go and
Right.
who shouldn't go?
Okay, well, thank you.
Trouble here, but can't we get the Russians involved also with curbing Iran's nuclear program?
Right. And I think that this, as I mentioned in my remarks, I think that Russia has much of its attention is really on the negative consequences of a U.S. action. And I think there's a lot, we can talk maybe offline, and a lot of you already know that Russia felt somewhat spurned by the Libyan episode where they actually signed on to that. And a lot of people sort of make the claim that Russia lost stature in that. But Russia really, the deal that Russia made about signing on to Libya had more to do with U.S. support for what was going on within Russia than within the region. And so They have also seen the outcome of the Libyan episode and some of the uncertainty and instability there. So it gets back to my bigger point. Now, the question is whether or not Russia can be induced or play a constructive role, and I agree with you, that's the real challenge, because I would argue that they actually have quite limited influence over the Syrian government. And to the extent that the Obama administration has an overarching strategy, it probably should focus on some of the broader regional players in the dimensions that Dr. Rubin mentioned vis-a-vis Iran and with Saudi Arabia and some of the other stakeholders in this, and where Russia could play a more constructive role. But I think if we confine it to the Syrian conflict, I think our interests are different and Russia's leverage is much more limited. Let me take another question. How about a
couple of
yeah.
Can I,
Okay,
can I
very
take
good.
the next question since I have the microphone right here?
Yeah.
Can I, right here,
Camilo in the corner.
on the floor.
Stand up.
Okay.
My name is Camilo Caballero, student in international affairs. And my question is more of an idealistic question and kind of fun to think about. With regards to Russia supporting Syria against groups like Al-Qaeda and other factions, is it possible that the U.S. can gain, not in a good way, some of the extremist attacks or future attacks that are being planned by Al-Qaeda to be focused towards Russia through Chechnya instead of the U.S., since the Russians is fighting against
I'll
group?
defer to our counter-terrorist expert about this strategy of redirecting terrorism. So,
Yeah, I'm not really sure how to answer that, to be perfectly honest. I mean, it doesn't really seem likely. I don't really know what to say beyond that. I mean, there is an interesting connection with the Chechens in that one of the actually like very prominent hardline Islamic groups is actually led by a Chechen in Syria, which is kind of interesting. But as far as that, I mean, I think that, at least for in this particular conflict, I mean, Al-Qaeda is focused in the region. They're not thinking beyond. They're just, I mean, these particular groups are operating really in Syria and perhaps in Iraq as well, but that's predominantly. Spill over into yeah, I mean, I think that obviously is a concern. I mean, that's always a concern with funding rebels with arms, is that the conflict could have the potential to spread. You know, I mean, that's always a concern, and that's I mean, that's a big concern for the U.S. That's been, and I think that's probably one of the reasons why the U.S. has held off supplying, you know, large amounts of arms to the rebels. So yeah, that's definitely a concern.
Bob, did you want to add to something?
I just want to add a quick comment. We have to really keep in mind the big picture. And in my mind, the big picture is bringing Russia into the community of Western states. So the last thing we want to do is become their adversary, and the first thing we want to do is encourage them slowly but surely, once again, to be a player in the international community, working with us. This does, as Sergei Karaganov, and you may have seen the article mentioned recently from Russia, this may provide a partial opportunity for that. The second thing we need to keep in mind is there are only 8 states not signatory to the Chemical Weapons Convention. Syria is one of them. Now, if we can come out of this with Syria giving up its chemical weapons, and it's not an easy task, but if we can come out of this with that, that is a major advance for us. It's a win in the international system. After which, if we want to play again with other rebels, as some of us, as Jenna suggested, we can play. But keep in mind the big picture here. Where are we trying to go with the entire international system, as opposed to what are we trying to do with Nusra or whatever, yeah, Nusra or other kind of groups.
Thanks, Bob. Now, I'm hesitating giving you a mic. I'm hoping you're not going to go ballistic on us, but go ahead.
Hi, Nick Selby, ME undergrad. I feel like a lot of the frustration among American citizenry involves the focus of the American government in pursuing a military Syria option. What factors specifically block the United States from pursuing a non-destructive option?
Anybody? Anybody want to take that? Why did we default to the military option as opposed to not exploring some of these others?
I'll speak to it in a larger context. Actually, former Secretary of Defense Gates in 2007 in the Landon Lecture at University of Kansas articulated very well. That is, over the last 30 years, in particular, the State Department and very much in particular, USAID has effectively been decimated in its ability to do, to act beyond program management in terms of number of individuals who are employed. So that limits your capability right there. Whereas there have been a whole number of things that in the past had been done under the State Department that are now effectively being done by the military, because they're the ones who have the capacity and the capability to do it because they've got the budgets to do it. For example, I have a good friend right now who is chief of humanitarian mine program, it's demining program in Africa, who's also a major in the Army and a former Army Ranger.
Anybody else? Bob, do you want to add?
Well, we have sanctions on Syria, so it's not that we haven't employed other tools, but the relative leverage that we have over Syria with these other tools is minor. And so this is probably why the president had moved early to suggest that we would use, we'd like to see regime change and ultimately use military force.
Anybody else? Okay. Let's have the fellow in the blue shirt.
My name is Christopher Yu. I'm a high school student at Etowah High School, and I was wondering how we would address the refugee crisis in Syria aside from the conflict itself.
Okay. Larry, you want to take that refugee?
As far as U.S. policy goes, is the question of how the United States policy? Yes. Well, I think it would be working with, clearly working with regional partners or allies or non-allies, even in the sense, because there's an incentive so that many of the countries there don't have this, don't have political instability there. You can look in a broader perspective of what, for instance, a country like Jordan has gone through since the Iraq War, hundreds of thousands of refugees coming through in the period since the Iraq War coming out, and then also not having to absorb so many Syrians in the last period of time, Turkey especially, and in the recent period, and in particular Lebanon, and people have talked about these types of events there. I think at this point, the United States is, I don't know particularly what its actual specific policy is towards that, but I know that it's working with the international community to provide sometimes humanitarian relief. But I think it's the question of how it's going to do this so that this humanitarian problem at those countries don't become an inordinate strain on the actual political stability of let's say, countries like Jordan, who not just from the demographic perspective are really straining, but also from a resource perspective. Other countries can weather the storm better, like Turkey, but Jordan is a difficult, dire strait in that way, and Lebanon from the sectarian perspective.
Great, thanks.
It's a good question.
Hi, Mickey, do you want to add something here on the right to protect? This is one of the issues that has not received as much attention here, at least in the panel.
Speak briefly about the very little role that responsibility to protect as a new idea has had. It had very little mobilizing force in the Syrian crisis. We had in 2005 this agreement at the UN General Assembly that countries have a responsibility to protect populations that are under attack if the home governments do not do anything. And recent events, interventions in Libya and then in the Ivory Coast certainly elevated the hope of the supporters of R2P that a new dawn began, because both of these interventions were at least partially justified by reference to the responsibility to protect by the home governments of their populations. But it seems to me that Syria has showed what Darfur and Rwanda show, that if there's no willingness really to intervene, there's going to be no intervention. And one striking thing to me, as somebody who teaches human rights, is just how little movement there really was from the very beginning and even now to really do anything effectively to stop the killings in Syria. There were some attempts at the UN Security Council early on, U.S.-led attempts to condemn Syria, but at no point was either the United States or anybody else really ready to enforce, measures such as humanitarian corridors or no-fly zones. So even measures short of full-scale use of force did not have, even U.S. support, not to mention broader international support.
Thanks, and that was one of the plants. That was Dr. Miklas Fabry here at the Sam Nunn School. There's somebody in the back, way back there.
Hi, Mrs. Shepherd, with DTRI. And I was hoping you guys could talk a little bit about the implications to United States credibility and other, I guess, abroad and security agreements, like the U.S., Israel, Iran, or even the U.S. and their, I guess, alliance with Japan and China flexing their muscles in the South China Sea.
Okay, anybody want to take on the credibility issue?
I'll be happy to start.
You can start it, Bob.
Well, I think that's a red herring. An awful lot of people are making a big deal about the United States losing credibility. I think the fact the United States has demonstrated some significant flexibility here is credible in its own sense. And as I said earlier, if you keep your eye on the bigger picture, longer-term opportunities here, what we are doing now is probably the best thing we could do under the circumstances. Our population didn't want to use force. The president doesn't want to use force. The only people that would really probably like us to use force are some very hardliners in our own country, and of course the rebels who would see that as a possible opportunity to take advantage of some dissipation on the part of the Syrian rebels, and perhaps some of our allies and friends in the region that support the rebel effort.
I'd underscore that by noting that credibility is really in the eyes of the beholder, and notwithstanding that President Obama keeps reminding us that all of his statements are credible, he may believe them, but that's really beside the point. And another thing to keep in mind about credibility is that it's a graduated scale. Not everything is equal. And you demonstrate credibility in a number of ways, and there are a number of conditions that have to be taken into consideration, such as the balance of power, the balance of risk, the pain tolerance, the issues at stake, how clearly you articulate these issues. And I would also argue, and there's been some scholarship on this, we talk a lot about the problems of a democracy and all of the pulling and hauling and the problems with transparency, and it's very difficult to play poker in the democracies. But international diplomacy is not really about poker. It's very rarely just only about information. It's also about incentives. And frankly, there's some advantages to the democratic institutions, and there have been a number of scholars that have talked about democracies being very good at leveraging the transparency of those institutions such that when they do issue a threat, it is credible because there are restraints. We're not going to go, a politician is not going to make a declaration that he can't support based on the transparency of the political process. And therefore, when they articulate a decisive threat, they've got the country behind them. And so there's a confirmatory effect on that as well. So credibility is a red herring if you just sort of look at any articulation and extrapolate from it. There are conditions. It matters what the target's perspectives are, and there's even some advantages in these very transparent domestic political environments like the democratic structures that we have. Let me see. We have a couple more minutes, so let me pick somebody else back there. Yeah. If there's no mic, you can just yell.
Well, let me start off by saying on Saturday, the Syrian government did submit to the UN a notice of ascension to the CWC. So that is indicating that at least they are supporting, they're acting. Now, they have 30 days, and by the treaty, in 30 days it enters into force, and they will be a state party then to the treaty, which then opens up some other consequences within international law. So just wanted to, so Syria has made that movement. As far as the rest of your question, I'm going to pass it over to one of my colleagues.
One quick comment. I mean, I think this is a very cynical sort of response, and I don't mean it to be as such, but this is an argument people have made, sort of a more realist kind of argument. But you know, that U.S. strategic interest in the region was very much sort of in favor of a civil war, and that it's basically sort of bleeding Hezbollah and Iran, you know, of draining of resources and things like that. So, you know, yes, we have this agreement, and then the civil war continues, so perhaps it's just sort of status quo, you know.
Great. Anybody? I saw one, but way back there.
So, my question is kind of going to be to that over the table. But what happens, I guess, what happens if Assad does fall? What is the likelihood and what are the risks of Syria becoming kind of a failed state, kind of along the lines of Somalia? And what kind of implications does that have to the region, especially as international forces in the area, particularly in the Golan Heights, just lost a significant contributor of troops that Austria pulled out from one of the UN missions there.
Okay, thanks. Larry, why don't you take the first crack?
Yeah, that's a great question, as all of them have forgot their comment that have been. I mean, I think this potential scenario is not going to, of the fall of an Assad regime, end anything by any means. And I would guess, and I rarely make predictions, even though many political science colleagues not here like to make them. But I don't think it's going to end overnight by any means, and it would lead, if not even more brutal civil war and continue external intervention, even on behalf of the rebels and various forces jockeying for time. The question, of course, then is a question of border security and many of the issues that go along. Now, I would imagine the direction still of whatever groups that are there are still directed towards the conflict itself, as opposed to the errant mortar fire that may lead. But the issue, I think, is the humanitarian / refugee one that again may cause even greater problems or continuation, we'll say, of what's happened recently and will probably increase in the future.
Yeah. I mean, as always, I agree with Larry, but just also, I'm sort of thinking about the way in which potentially Assad could fall. I mean, I also hate to make predictions. I feel that we can't really predict, like, if Assad falls, who's going to come to power and what the state is going to look like, if it's going to be a failed state. But then you think about, well, if it is, oftentimes militant organizations take very much advantage of a failed state kind of situation where there is a lack of state capacity, and they are able to go in and kind of provide for people in a way that a state isn't able to. But also thinking about the way in which Assad could fall. I mean, thinking about whether he falls through, whether he just loses like a next election, right? Or whether he is imposed by a foreign regime. And that's a very different kind of process, There's lots of interesting studies that are coming out looking at foreign imposed regime change and kind of the effectiveness of this. And it's been shown to not be that great and not have that great of long-term implications, particularly for democracy. So it sort of depends on how you're thinking about Assad leaving power. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind.
One thing to keep in mind, Jenna, along with what Jenna said, is Assad said he would stay until the next elections, after which we have to see how the elections came out. So it's quite possible that what we're looking at is some transition period where he would actually agree to step down under certain circumstances, or at least have a fair election.
Right.
Yep. Did you have something to add?
Well, I was just going to add the other thing that I think needs to be emphasized is the what would happen next. I mean, we're talking about, and this is why I'm really skeptical about a political settlement of any sort. We're talking about an absolutely brutal civil war that has invoked both religious, but also these say semi-religious along sectarian lines, and these groups are tied to some Christian Orthodox groups, as well as the Sunni businessmen are aligned with the regime, but in particular, of course, the Alawi sect. Many parts of it are aligned basically with survival, and without it, everybody knows. I think it's not really a shock that it would be an absolute bloodbath, even more so than the 100,000 people that have died already.
Okay, I think we have one more question. Time for one more.
I'm Murtaza, and I graduated from Georgia Tech a couple of years ago, but I'm still on campus, so I decided to join in. My question is related to international law, and it's like stepping back a little bit from the present situation. How does international law draw a line between uprising and versus
other nations with their own vested interests coming in and trying to support the uprising through, and one is a diplomatic channel. It's like saying, okay, we support the uprising versus supplying weapons. So how does international law draw a line between supporting diplomatically versus actually interfering in a sovereign nation's, politics or internal matters?
International law, my understanding, and I'm not an international law scholar, I just gave you what I understand of that, but international law does not speak to the issue of whether states can get involved in conflict except through the UN Charter. And Chapter 7 defines how states will act in those situations. And so beyond that, there are laws about Geneva Conventions on how you treat prisoners and those kinds of things. You can break those laws. People accuse the United States of having broken those laws recently. But in terms of international law of action that can be taken, it is governed by Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. And so unless you can get the UN Security Council and its 5 members to either agree or agree to abstain on a vote, the international community does not act in that regard. Individual states can take action as they see fit, short of war, in terms of sanctions and those kinds of things. But as far as hostilities, it's governed by Chapter 7.
Let me end. I see a very enthusiastic student back there, and I'd love to end with that enthusiasm. So please ask a question. Okay. Bob, do you want to take a stab at the domestic implications of this?
I was impressed with Paul's comment immediately after the news broke, at least with regard to his understanding of international law, and he pointed specifically to 3 cases in which the president can use and not use power. So he's going to oppose, from an international law perspective, that use. I'm never really certain where McCain is going to be. Sometimes he seems supportive, sometimes he doesn't seem supportive. I think the division in the United States is usually going to continue to be fundamentally between those who oppose Obama and the Democrats and those who oppose. So you're largely going to see Republican opposition, but not all. I mean, a lot of Republicans think we should be going, we should have been more forceful. McCain has said he thinks we should be more forceful. So he may not go along with the president because he wanted it to be more forceful. What's really going to be key here in terms of domestic politics is if we fail. That is, this accord breaks down. And it breaks down fundamentally because Assad is in non-compliance with what he had agreed to do. At that point in time, I think you're going to see a domestic consensus for action, even though it'll be in violation of international law, and I think the president will get authority to use weapons if he needs to. Having said that, presidents frequently have operated outside of domestic law, and so his threat of using force if it breaks down is credible in the eyes of others because presidents in the past have ignored domestic law, not gone to Congress, and acted on their own. And my view is that the president is making that threat, and from their perspective, the foreigners' perspective, it's credible.
Thank you, Bob. Let me just close by noting one thing. When I first came to Georgia Tech, I was asked to give a lecture at your department at HTS on the Vietnam War. And I was very fortunate to be able to meet a professor who was on campus during that period. And en route to the lecture, he mentioned to me that he didn't remember the Vietnam War, and the only thing he did remember is that nobody talked about it on campus during that period. And I'm heartened by the turnout today and the quality of questions and the enthusiasm with which you guys are taking your responsibility, which is to think hard about these issues, because they do matter. So with that, let me thank you, and please join me in thanking our panelists for sharing their expertise and getting this conversation going. Thank you.